And now, without any further delay, let's begin today's event. Once again, top 5 trends in digital identity verification, how to put your best foot forward. Sponsored by Mitek and hosted by American Banker. I would like to introduce our moderator for today, and that is Penny Crossman. Penny, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Christina, and welcome everybody. Digital identity is one of the more intriguing topics in fintech and banking tech today. A really well thought out, intelligent digital identity solution could help refugees from war-torn countries rebuild their lives. It could help all of us spend less time at the Department of Motor Vehicles, and it can help safeguard us from being victims of identity theft. And it could help banks avoid giving bank accounts to criminals and money launderers and onboard new customers through digital channels much more efficiently. There are 2 speakers on this webcast today. Bob Meara is a senior analyst in Celent's banking group. He has a research focus in branch and ATM delivery channels, omnichannel delivery, and check and cash payment processing technologies. Before joining Celent, he was director of product marketing at Allergent. Before that, he had jobs in marketing and brand management at Stonebridge Technologies, Bell South, Haynes Corporation, and Procter & Gamble, and he was also a commissioned naval officer. And we have Steve Craig, who is Director of Product in Mitek's global identity business. He has more than a decade of experience in fintech. He previously worked on software as a service and mobile solutions for Digital Insight, Intuit, and Hewlett-Packard. So there are 4 objectives of this webinar today. The first is to review the top 5 trends in digital identity verification and where the industry is going. We're going to discover 5 use cases you need to support and why each is important. We're going to learn how to avoid common digital identity verification pitfalls. And we're going to look at solutions to bridge the gap from the physical to the digital world. So now I'd like to turn things over to Bob Meara.
Thank you, Penny. And good afternoon, everyone. So as Penny mentioned, this is quite an important topic, but it's also a very wide-ranging topic. It's applicable across multiple industries, from government to healthcare and travel and entertainment. It utilizes a variety of approaches, from physical identity documents, from passwords and biometrics and multi-layers, and it is necessary for a variety of reasons. In financial services, it is similarly far wide-ranging. What we'd like to do is focus specifically on its use for account opening, so specifically new customer origination for a DDA, savings, card, or lending product. We won't be talking about its use, for example, for account access and routine authentication. We think there's at least 5 reasons, or call them key trends if you'd like, on why digital identity verification has become suddenly increasingly important. Now, some of these are self-evident and won't be news at all to you. We'd like to camp on a couple of them in the following slides. First is, as we interact with banks and credit unions across the asset tier, there is a universal ambition now among most institutions to increase digital customer acquisition. The industry has invested heavily in digital, but yet our sales mix remains disproportionately branch-focused. I'll avoid the debate on how and why that may be remaining the case, but suffice to say it's important, and it's a high priority on almost all institutions' priority list to stand up a credible and low-friction digital customer acquisition mechanism. Within that, digital identity verification is obviously important. Secondly, as we all know, knowledge-based authentication, or KBA, which has been a stalwart mechanism for identity verification for decades, has become increasingly ineffective because of the massive and multiple data breaches. It's no surprise that fraudsters know the KBA questions better than most consumers and have the answers at their fingertips. It is just simply a flawed mechanism. And even when it was effective, historically for identity verification, it has always been a loser in the eyes of your customers. It's universally hated, it's frustrating, it adds friction and time and complexity to what might otherwise be a very simple process. And when that process is administered digitally in a self-service mechanism, all the more important to make it fast and intuitive and low friction. Thirdly, and the most obvious point here is that customers increasingly prefer mobile. The data is widespread across multiple retail categories that consumers are increasingly shopping and buying products and services with a mobile app experience. Banking is behind multiple other retail categories in that regard. Mobile banking utilization is roughly at 50% of U.S. banked adults now and continues to grow, but much less new customer acquisition occurs through the mobile channel. But it is growing. Fourthly, fraud mechanisms are becoming more advanced and fast-changing, and emphasis here on fast-changing. It's important that whatever you stand up to mitigate fraud losses, that you don't put up a static system. It's important that the platform and your organization be constantly learning and changing to keep pace of the evolving fraud threat. And fifthly, and maybe the least intuitively obvious here, is mobile is certainly an important self-service channel, but it's no longer simply that, and I'll explain that in a moment. So this slide looks at the historical progression of what is now a bifurcated retail delivery environment in most banks, right? It's one of those slides that only a left-brain analyst would create. Each of these retail delivery channels, of course, arrived at different times, and they evolved to be created and managed rather independently. And for years, that wasn't particularly a problem. For example, when the ATM channel saw a decade or two of robust growth in the 70s and 80s, no one then thought it was problematic that call center and ATM interactions were not thoroughly coordinated, right? Because at least we thought those two channels were for manifestly different reasons. Consumers used them differently and rather independently, and so there was no thought of omnichannel back then. We thought it was clear, right? And we thought that because most banks had although these separate channels were developed and managed as separate platforms with separate organizations, the purposes and the metrics were very well developed, very finely honed at most institutions. For example, branch operations could tell you in great detail about, for example, teller transaction volumes per day of week, per hour of the day, and even branch by branch. There's predictive analytics to help you manage branch staffing accordingly to reduce operational cost and improve the service level with your customers. And similarly, you had robust contact center and internet metrics and so on for the mobile and the ATM. But what we didn't know was the real customer journey across channels, and at many institutions we don't know that even today. Objectives have become blurred. Customer utilization has become blurred as we learn more and more about customer journeys and their omni-channel interaction choices with financial institutions, and organizations are blurring now as banks are trying to grapple with how do we manage in a omni-channel world. And in this context, channel platforms are consolidating and evolving also. Branches are evolving from traditional teller and platform sales roles with their separate and distinct systems into a more of a universal banking role with a universal banking application. Contact centers are evolving from call centers to multimedia, social, and predominantly digital interactions. Internet and mobile banking historically were two separate platforms, often from two different vendors, managed by two different organizations. All that is in a state of change. It's becoming increasingly common for banks to have a consolidated Internet and mobile platform or unified digital platform. And we think that a broader and purposeful omni-channel IT architecture is going to result in an omni-channel system of engagement across the organization, ultimately across lines of business and all these channels, eliminating the separate and expensive maintenance effort to be redundantly used to manage multiple channels. But that evolution will be slow in coming at many banks. But in the context of digital, the fascinating thing is it's no longer just a self-service channel. It is becoming, and in many banks has already become, in effect, an omni-channel platform, both for customer sales, self-service, as well as the primary interaction mechanism between your frontline personnel and the customer. For example, origination and servicing are increasingly being done with tablets in bank branches. Assisted self-service with kiosk or ATM-like devices can be overridden and managed by your frontline staff using a tablet, wirelessly interacting with the device. Digital appointment booking or concierge services are often done with a tablet. Interactions with your contact center are increasingly click-to-call or real-time chat or even virtual assistants. All those things are digital interaction mechanisms that have nothing to do with telephony, which was the original genesis of the call center, right? And even the customer interaction with ATMs. Most notably cardless cash access is perhaps just the first of a growing number of use cases that involve customers interacting with the ATM using mobile. And even at the branch and ATM, mobile is becoming central for self-service transaction support, as I mentioned, for sales and service, and as bankers venture outside the branch into the community. They are tablet-wielding mobile bankers, and that use case is showing significant traction. It's a win-win for banks as well as their small business, medium business merchants. And why is this important? And it's important because omni-channel customer acquisition, even though banks across the asset tiers assert it's a high priority and an important priority for them, it remains aspirational for most banks. From our surveys, for account opening and non-mortgage lending, banks report, although of course there's variations in from bank to bank, on average 80 to 85% of new sales are attributed to the branch channel, despite the massive growth of online and mobile banking for transaction purposes. Now, some of this 80% may be imprecise channel attribution, but from bank to bank, we hear that for a variety of reasons, the branch remain over-reliant on the branch for new account sales, and that's just inconsistent with the massive investment in digital, and it's something that many banks want to change. And a key part of improving those numbers is to introduce as low friction and intuitive and simple and fast experience as possible for your customers, while at the same time not compromising on fraud and compliance imperatives. For too many would-be customers, friction occurs early and often. In this context, the right identity verification approach can help. There's multiple reasons for friction, and in some cases, institutions do it to themselves. They have complex products with the onboarding requiring multiple business reviews and overrides and approvals. Some product choices aren't intuitive, and in many cases, there's too many steps in the process, and it could be a very easy and simplified process. So it's not necessarily a technology issue. It can be a process and a product complexity issue. In some cases, the processes are too involved. KBA questions can't be answered by most customers, or they're required to provide information the bank already knows about them, or the mechanism to provide the required information is inconvenient. For example, having to key in a lot of information on a small mobile device is a lose-lose proposition for banks and their customers. And lastly, in some cases, banks do it to themselves by requiring a branch visit from a procedural standpoint, and we think that's a terrible idea. Customers may, by their own choice, wish to visit a branch to open a new account, in part because they may feel comfortable about that. They may have questions they'd like answers to in person, and by all means, let's provide as wonderful of a branch experience as possible in those cases, but don't make them go to the branch when you could otherwise have them open an account in just a matter of a few minutes on their device. So as customer experience is an imperative, so is compliance and fraud. Both are imperatives. And historically, there's been a fairly intractable compromise required here. As risk and compliance concerns were elevated and focused upon, that historically has degraded the customer experience. Conversely, when CX was improvements to CX were sought, often that required trade-offs in compliance. And we think both of those are a bad idea. There's got to be a way for banks to at least, to some extent, have their cake and eat it too in this regard. And historically, that's been very, very challenging to achieve. But with modern digital identity verification solutions, achieving this trade-off with acceptable outcomes for both compliance and risk and customer experience is more easily achieved now than ever before. And so since it's an omnichannel world, banks are compelled to solve for all the use cases that customers may find themselves in. And so I'd like to review each of these quickly and then show how they're supported in a digital identity verification environment. One obvious use case is an 100% desktop environment, and so banks, of course, must support desktop origination with a great user experience. Interestingly, that may involve the use of mobile device in the process, but the process would be started and finished on a desktop. So two very separate devices, and there's very fascinating and customer-friendly ways of handing off from device to device. And Steve Craig will show you that later on. Second is a mobile web experience. As consumers increasingly shop using mobile devices, banks need to support them with a mobile web-based origination. Now, of course, an adaptive web browser interface is needed, but so is thoughtful redesign of the user interface, redesign of the workflow, and the use of mechanisms to reduce manual data entry because data entry is so difficult in this environment. So it's not simply a matter of having an adaptive UI. It really needs to be a mobile-first kind of design. And Steve will touch on this. Digital ID verification is fundamentally more difficult in a mobile web environment than in an in-app environment. And so as you think through the mobile web use case, ensure that your solution does a good job of delivering in that environment. Mobile in-app use case is also important. It's not as popular to originate in-app, but for existing customers that may wish to purchase additional products and services with their financial institution could certainly initiate an in-app experience. Some banks prefer in-app experiences because of the greater efficacy of the AML and fraud attributes of the solution in that operating environment. We think it's important to give customers the choice and have adequate efficacy in both cases. Don't forget the branch experience. Too many institutions have an otherwise fairly low-friction process digitally and then have a broken paper-based wet signature scan and print document approach in the branch, and that's no longer acceptable in today's omnichannel environment. If you solve for digital, solve for mobile, solve for branch at the same time using the same technology, and ensure that customers can start in one channel and finish in another, so that your employees don't need to start them all over again. And that's important for contact centers too, right? Although a relatively low percentage of new customer originations, contact center staff do originate loans and accounts on behalf of customers, and probably will continue to do so. And so sometimes contact center and branch personnel are picking up where customers left off. At least ideally they should be. In far too many cases they're forced to start over again. And so be sure you solve for that. And achieving full use case coverage requires that your solutions support multiple environments. One is mobile web that we talked about. Mobile SDK is a second for in-app experiences, for mobile in-app use cases, as well as an alternative in the branch. And then thirdly is for desktop internet and branch and contact center, making sure you can facilitate a web to mobile handover. And Steve will demonstrate how that's done later today. And so if you boil it all down, this is digital identity verification at a glance. Said simply, think of this whole idea as a way to answer a number of questions about your customers or prospects without asking them a bunch of questions. Right? Historically, banks asked customers and prospects a bunch of questions to answer the basic questions. Who are they? And are they on a watch list? We'd like to be able to answer those questions without asking the customers any questions. And those questions are simply, is this an authentic ID? Government-issued IDs are in the United States are universally accepted as a valid identity verification mechanism. But the challenge is it authentic? And secondly, is the person presenting the ID the person on the ID? Because it could be a stolen identity. Those have been used to open accounts multiple times. And then thirdly, is it a live image? Because we want the customer, of course, to be present in the moment presenting the ID, but fraudsters usually are not present because they may be using stolen identities and stolen digital portraits of the customers they are impersonating, and so mechanisms need to test for that. And along the way, your customer authentication process, and of course these are wrapped in business rules that are highly configurable and controllable from financial institution to institution. So you may call out to external databases simply as a mechanism to auto pre-fill forms. So for example, a call to the cell phone carrier on a mobile-initiated application could render name and address very quickly to the person to whom that cell phone belongs, saving the customer keying in that information, for example. Or you could call and do a call out to blacklists, watch lists, etc. to manage risk along the way, and that could be done very seamlessly to the user. Verifying that a government-issued ID is authentic is a simple idea, but a rather complex process. I'm not expert in all the nuances of this. I'll leave some of that process to Steve. But suffice to say that, at least in today's state of the art, it begins and it ends with image analytics. So in other words, a very good, very usable image needs to be captured. Because if the image is not usable, then even the best analytics and machine learning is going to fail. Typically, document verification involves capturing the image of both the front and the back of the ID. The ID back has a barcode, which is very easily read. That's kind of the easy part of the image analytics. And that information is then compared with validated information captured on the front of the document. Verification checks follow the data extraction and integrity checks to both classify the document and to do a multi-point forensic examination of a variety of security features on the document. These are very structured documents Each state has its own published design, and so the algorithms can be fine-tuned state by state to look precisely on the image for recognizable artifacts. And the end result of all of this is a confidence score, and business rules can be configured to either proceed with an adequate confidence score or introduce other factors along the way, or to route the ID to a expert manual review process. Ensuring that the person presenting the ID is the person whose picture is on the ID is done using facial biometrics. The system basically compares the selfie of the presenter with the photo ID portrait and renders then a confidence score. Each institution establishes its own threshold and its own business rules to how to deal with it. Accommodating this, so facial biometrics is not the only factor utilized. We talked about external data calls a slide or two earlier. Those can be done in real time also to supplement the decision process. And then thirdly is liveness test. This just establishes that the customer is present. And of course, this is very important because, as I said earlier, fraudsters typically are not present. Liveness testing has two kind of flavors. One is active. In other words, it is a challenge-response interaction between your customer and the application. For example, blink or turn your head right, turn your head left, and the system is capturing images in video mode and can very quickly establish whether the image is live and compliant. And then there are also passive tests that don't require that same kind of challenge-response interaction to establish liveness. Now, if this hasn't been particularly convincing, if you are still a scoffer or very much predisposed to persist in your KBA approach, know that recently enacted federal legislation, and this is very recent, March, as a matter of fact, very much codifies what we've been talking about. Now, we've got enough acronyms in the industry. This introduced yet another one. It's called the Mobile Act, and mobile doesn't mean mobile as we know mobile. It means making online banking initiation legal and easy, and legal and easy are very good twin objectives for this. It basically authorizes financial institutions to scan and retain information from driver's licenses and ID cards as a part of customer digital onboarding process, and further stipulates that the records be destroyed after the process. And this would overrule any potential state legislation that up to this point hasn't recognized digital images of identity documents as valid. So think of this maybe to the non-legal mind, as mine is this is kind of the check 21 of digital ID verification. And so how should banks proceed? A few solid thoughts here before handing the presentation off to Steve Craig. First is begin with realistic expectations, but by realistic I don't mean low. I've spoken to a number of banks whose aspiration with digital ID verification is to match the pass rate that they're currently achieving by having unskilled, i.e. not highly trained forensic ID specialists in their branches. So I think that's a very, very low bar. Your bar must be much higher than that. A very high straight-through processing rate should be your expectation here. And an expectation for continuous learning is important, not just in the ID verification process, but the larger customer origination process. There's lots of points in the process where things get broken, but they are easily fixed. And so having a very rigorous and ongoing view of the customer journey through that, looking at cart abandonment rates, where they get abandoned, how they get abandoned, how long things are taking, can help you quickly improve and significantly so the customer experience and your digital sales results. Secondly, ensure that you're supporting all 5 of these use cases. In almost every implementation that we're familiar with, banks start somewhere, right? They typically start in one channel with one product and expand from there. That's a logical, time-tested approach to doing things. Just don't stop with mobile. Mobile is a very appropriate starting point for many banks, but please don't stop there. Solve for the omnichannel problem. You'll be glad you did. Thirdly, among solution providers, there are massive differences in the extent to which expert review is required. It has to do, among other things, in differences in the machine learning algorithms. The better the algorithms, the more confident the results. The lower percentage of them must be subject to expert review. Straight-through processing is a worthy goal, but it's unrealistic for 100% of applications. I think that's straightforward, but I would invite you to look carefully across available solutions to minimize the incidence of review, because not only does it add cost, but it adds friction and time. There's, in some cases, a fairly substantial delay or latency introduced, and that's not a good customer experience. And then lastly, as you finalize your decision, I would invite you to certainly have thorough investigations and dialogue with providers, but don't necessarily take their stated results. Test this yourself with your own test deck, with a variety of documents and a reasonably good number of them, known fraudulent documents and known good documents, and make sure that what the engines spit out is absolutely right. It's straightforward to test it, so we would invite you to do your own testing, and do so across both in-app and mobile web environments with a wide variety of documents, and in so doing, you'll understand the limits of mobile web. And so that's all for me. Next, I'd like to introduce Steve Craig from Mitek Systems.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the great content, and thank you, Penny, for the introductions earlier. Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Craig, and I'm Director of Product at Mitek. Mitek's focused on enabling trust in a digital world, and I've just got a few slides to go through, and then I'll give you a brief demo. We want to save enough time to get through questions and answers, so I'll be pretty brisk. If you're not familiar with Mitek, we're a global leader in digital identity verification. You may know us through the mobile deposit product. That's the process of depositing a check with your smartphone. Mitek is a public company. We're on the NASDAQ. We're based in San Diego, so I'm speaking to you live from the San Diego headquarters. But we also have offices globally. We now have offices in New York, London, Amsterdam, Barcelona, and Paris. We've made a few acquisitions over the last few years, first with ID Checker in the Netherlands, then with eCar in Spain, and most recently with A2IA based in Paris and New York. We've got over 1.5 billion transactions processed in the mobile deposit space. That's turned out to be a phenomenal product in the banking industry. It's really changed people's relationship with the smartphone and banking. It's one of the main features that gets used next to balance checking and transfers. With that, we also have established a proven mobile user experience in the ID capture process. We've impacted about 80 million consumers through our MySnap product. That is a camera library that allows an automatic capture of documents. Started out with checks and now supports IDs, driver's licenses, passports, and other generic documents through the financial services process. We just recently had another go live with one of the top banks in the U.S., giving us 5 for 5 in terms of top banks using the MySnap product. But we also have global expertise beyond checks and identity documents. Our teams and our systems process thousands of documents daily across the spectrum, from not just driver's licenses, but documents that are unique and special to the countries that we serve. The Mitek model is also one of partnership. So we have over 5,800 customers, and that includes financial institutions, companies in travel, the sharing economy. So we're really focused on the identity problem, not just in one space, but wherever there's a need to truly know who the customer is on the other side of that device. We also approach our customers with a very strong focus on customer success. So our model is to be there to ensure that the goals are being met for whatever workflow that you're implementing our systems in. The product that we're going to focus on today is our Mobile Verify product, and this gets at the heart of a lot of the things that Bob mentioned around trust. There has been quite a bit of broken trust. There's a lot of breaches that have occurred just in the last few years alone. Millions of records are exposed. There are individuals who can purchase your details out on the dark web and through sites to be able to impersonate you or to use pieces of your information to create synthetic identities to defraud either you or the financial institution itself, creating a nice income stream for themselves. So these are just some statistics in the lending area. We've seen a large increase in the records stolen. We see a huge multi-billion-dollar impact of those and lots of fraud losses occurring. So our product, Mobile Verify, is bridging that gap from the traditional physical verifications that you might do to one that can be done in a digital or mobile context. So where you might have a face-to-face interaction or typically using data from a credit bureau to drive the knowledge-based authentication, implementing our products enable you to streamline that process. Mobile Verify specifically is about instant identity document and identity authentication. So we sit at an intersection between the identity verification process and a near seamless mobile experience. So the same process that one goes through to deposit a check, where you're taking the picture of the front and the picture of the back, we're doing the same with the strongest thing in your wallet, which is your identity card or your driver's license. We also add in the step, as Bob had mentioned, to make sure we can biometrically compare your face to the face on that document. So ultimately, what we accomplish is the goal for your institution of saying yes to more good customers. Of course, we want to stop the bad actors. We want to stop the fraudsters. But you want to be able to do more business with the good folks that are coming through your system. You want to combat abandonment. And abandonment could be the existing status quo of having to come into a branch or to fax or email in documents. We don't want that process to interrupt the flow of you having that person become your customer. Replacing or augmenting the knowledge-based authentication questions with all the data breaches and other information. As Bob mentioned, this data is out there. It's easy to spoof, so if someone has your credit report or other details about you, a lot of times you can go out and do a few Google searches and find enough information about someone to answer these questions. And also to reach new growth markets, to reach those that might be unbanked. This could be those that are new to credit, or those that are new to the country. You want to be able to reach those customers as well. And then ultimately, we still have regulations coming in. Bob mentioned the Mobile Act, which should help make this a little bit simpler. But there are anti-money laundering rules that exist for good reasons to fight crime rings and to fight terrorist funding activities, but just to ensure that you're doing a due process to know your customer. And then ultimately, cutting operational costs is important too, because if you're implementing steps that create more abandonment or steps that require more branch personnel or more manual reviewers on your side, that just switches the equation on what you could constitute as a viable account relationship. So that's Mobile Verify. Think of it as instant identity document and identity verification. The next slide I'm going to go into is a video. So you're going to see a very quick process in which I'm presenting my identity document and my face. We're only going to play this video once, so you may want to pay attention here. So it's going to load up. We're showing Mobile Verify with a face comparison. So we're going to start with my actual driver's license. Here we're using the MySnap product. You get real-time feedback. It has me move closer. I've captured that. I'm now going to flip to the back of my document. We're going to pick up the barcode on the back very quickly. It's almost too fast for you to see in a video here streaming, but we've captured it. Now we're going to flip to the front for the face. So with those three snaps, and that all happened in sequence, there's no cutting in the video there, we now see results that have come back. So we're submitting the front, the back, and the face image to our platform. We're processing those. In under 5 seconds, we're returning quite a bit of result back to at least in this demo to you so you could see, but in the behind the scenes, that data would inform your workflow and your process. So the approval that came through, that can be used to drive to the next step. Maybe it's a funding of an account or allowing a transaction to go through. So there's quite a bit, as Bob mentioned, in various channels. That was a native channel. We also support mobile web. Some of the challenges in mobile web are around just the support that the browser allows, but we have developed technologies to be able to ensure a very strong, high-resolution, solid capture to be able to do the processing. So I'm not going to spend too much time. The video stopped playing. We want to get into a question and answer session, so you can submit questions. I'm going to pass it back over to Penny. We're going to do some moderation and hopefully get to as many of these as we can. Thank you. Penny?
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. So, yeah, we have some great questions, and we do have a little time for more questions, so please feel free to type them in. So the first question is, what if the ID is fake and a fraudster has put their own picture on a legitimate-looking ID? Steve, what do you say to that?
That's a very good question. That's actually a very common fraud technique. We call that a photo replacement or a photo integration tampering. We've developed algorithms using machine learning technologies to spot that. Typically, when a photo is layered into an identity document, like a driver's license or a passport, there are security features in there. When a photo is placed over that, those security features break. So we can pick up on that tampering and signal that there has been a modification to that document and then return that back through the result. So in the demo that I gave, I didn't have a photo replacement there, so it was all green. But in that scenario, we'd flag that, and that could trigger an alternate workflow process.
Okay, great. And then we have a question about GDPR, the General Data Protection Rule in Europe. How does GDPR affect your process, and I guess what are the privacy issues that arise? Steve, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. Yeah, I can take that. GDPR went into effect last month in May, and Mitek fully supports and is compliant with GDPR. For us, the processing of that data, we have a couple options. So we have various retention rules that can be set. So when the data comes through, it can be purged out immediately. Our preference is typically to have some retention of that data in case there's customer support issues that arise with our customers, so that we can research that. But as part of the GDPR, a big component of that is giving the end user or end consumer the power to be forgotten in those systems. So we're set up so we can receive those requests from our customers. So in a GDPR process, let's say the person has opened a bank account in Europe and they reach out to the financial institution and say, we want that data to be removed. That financial institution, as our customer, would contact us, and we would ensure that we're complying with that request and removing it from systems. But generally, it's being purged out quick enough that we wouldn't run into a scenario of like a long-term hold on that data.
Okay. Our next question is, what's the experience for the user if they are just using the mobile web browser? Steve, again, that's for you.
Sure. So the mobile web browser, there are some limitations in what we can do in that browser environment. So on the native side, we have direct API access to the phone's hardware, so we can do some really unique things with the camera stream, like provide real-time feedback that is very smooth. On the mobile web, we're starting to get more access to that. In iOS 11, Apple opened up some APIs to use what is called a web RTC. It's a real-time streaming capability, but there are limitations in the experience. So on older devices, in a browser context, it can be a little bit juddery. So Mitek has developed a single image quality analysis that can be performed after the user captures the image. So that's also another differentiator. In the native, we're automatically taking the picture. In the web, the user pushes the button to take it, but we can at least provide feedback on whether it's blurry or if there is not enough lighting or if there's not enough resolution on the image. As the browsers and the hardware get more mainstream, like the higher-end phones get out there, we'll see more usage of the web streaming capability. So you'll have the opportunity to have a video-like experience in the browser. And Mitek actually has some innovations on the roadmap that will be coming out in fall to help support that. But it's a balance because you'll still have a lot of users that will have older Android phones or some of the older Apple devices that will have to fall back on the kind of manual image capture process.
Okay. Next question I'm going to direct to Bob Meara. The question is, I'm uncomfortable with the confidence score on digital identity. How do banks manage this? And what if an individual is on the fringe?
Well, the good thing is individual financial institutions determine what the fringe is, right? And so we talked about testing systems with known documents, right? And that can be used to establish a bank's confidence level. But often there's always a what next option for them. So nothing is 100%, well, rarely 100% confident, right? And so a below threshold confidence could result in a business rule that for example, invites an additional identity factor imposed, right? It could go out and extract additional information from third-party data sources to help substantiate, for example. So there's a variety of options short of denying that customer, but obviously there's times when that's the right approach.
Okay, and the next question is for Steve again. Are your clients using this process for fraud prevention, or are they layering in other tools for that purpose?
It's a good question as well. We see typically a multi-layered approach. So for Mitek, we're focused on the image capture, the data that's extracted, the authenticity of the document, the biometric face matching. But for those cases in which the result perhaps is not ideal, or maybe there is a fraudulent warning that has come with the document, maybe someone has changed the expiration of the document, those are things that our clients may invoke other systems for. They could be other databases, they could be data from credit bureaus, they could be device signals, or things from the telco carriers. So it really depends on the use case, the risk for the transaction, and then ultimately what the backup plan would be for that end user for the failure. So there's not a one-size-fits-all, but to answer directly, multiple layers for sure.
Okay. Next question is, relative to the facial image, how do you deal with changes such as hairstyle or facial hair or glasses and so forth?
Another good question. So the way that the face comparison component works, first of all, it's creating a biometric template on the fly, and that's using primarily facial geometry, which for most of the cases doesn't change with age or hairstyle. Those two templates, one being created off the document face, so the portrait on the ID, and the one created from the selfie, it's a fairly steady match rate over time. Of course, there are edge cases where you could have major plastic surgery, or you could have other scenarios where the face doesn't just match properly, or shadows on the ID, let's say a bad DMV portrait, for example. Those are the edge cases that would fall into some of those alternate workflow scenarios.
Okay. And I guess this is for you again, unless Bob wants to chime in about other products in the marketplace. But the question is, what does the data output look like? Does it automatically upload into a database or an application, for example?
Yeah, I can answer from the Mitek perspective, and Bob, if you want to add on after that. Mitek offers two primary components. So we have a client-side SDK, that is for the mobile image capture and image quality and liveness. And then we have server-side cloud APIs. That's where the image data gets sent through. So the model that we've adopted is for control for our customer. So the image capture is done typically on a mobile device or in the browser. The way those images get to us is they still are passing through our client's infrastructure and servers. So the transactions are seen. Those go over, they get processed through our cloud API, and then we return the result. It's usually in a JSON format, which is a technical structure that could then be interpreted through our customer's programmer to drive the result in the application or to drive the workflow. So we've adopted that model to give the most flexibility in implementation. We don't just take the image capture and then send it directly into our system for processing.
All right, next question is for Bob. How quickly do you see banks moving to a single omni-channel system of engagement?
Wow, so I can speculate. I think from our own survey results, now 9 months old, a small percentage are going to migrate to this within, the next 3 years. To me, it seems like not if, but when. But the when answer is going to widely vary. I think, to hazard a guess, a third of U.S. banks and credit unions will be there in 5 years. But I could be proven very wrong, which happens often.
So then we have a question. A question about how much latency is introduced when there is need for an expert review. Let's start with you, Steve, but I know, Bob, you also mentioned that step of the process. Steve, what is your answer from the Mitek point of view?
For our product suite, we have three layers. So what you saw today was our auto capability, so that's all automated system capability. The next layer is a manual review, which is generally a latency of 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the contract we have with the customer. And that's where a person is reviewing the details of the document and doing a cursory review to see if it's fraudulent. And then the expert review, that's when we're doing quite a thorough analysis of all the documents, typically more than one piece of information. That's done by a trained Border Patrol type person. We have quite a few of those at Mitek. And those generally run up to an hour, but also depending on the contractual relationship we have with the customer.
Bob, anything to add in terms of industry averages or what you're seeing?
Yeah, I don't have enough data points to cite an average, and I will say that the results are different from provider to provider, but also, as Steve said, it depends too, right? There's not one answer. A shorter latency is gonna cost the customer more money, right? Because they'll negotiate a stricter SLA, right? So it is kind of a variable that way, but I have seen big differences in the percentages of manual review that is required. In some vendor approaches, it's virtually 100%, which would then impose kind of a ongoing additional latency, which I think is a recipe for degraded customer experience and fundamentally unnecessary given the state of machine learning today.
All right, the next question is for Steve. The question is, how many forms of ID do you currently support? During the demo, it appeared there were only 2 options, driver's license and passport.
It's a very important question, and something to point out about the demo. The demo is not the product itself, so that's just a software that we put together to demonstrate the workflow and show the results. So we just had buttons there for the driver's license and the passport capture. Generally, we support the form factors that the industry would call ID1, ID2, ID3. So those are the business card-sized driver's license, ID card. In some countries, it might be a voter registration card. Different countries call different documents different things. Some countries don't have national ID document schemes, like the U.S., for example, doesn't. And then passports. But we also support a range of documents that can be manually captured, and that would be things that would go to our manual and expert review teams. So from a ID document type, it's probably in the dozens. From the country supported, it's in the hundreds, and then we've got just thousands of various permutations. So it can range in the auto, manual, and expert categories. That's usually a good question for an offline discussion.
Okay, great. Well, we are just about out of time. We'd like to thank Steve Craig and Bob Meara for the content they provided today. And I would like to thank Mitek and Celent for participating in and sponsoring this webcast. I would like to thank all of you for coming and giving us your attention. And on behalf of American Banker and Mitek, I want to wish you all a great afternoon.